So for months now, countries around the world have been struggling to stock up on face masks and other personal protective equipment.
Everyone desperately needs PPE and medical supplies. And that just means not only is the competition to get this stuff fierce, but the competition to get the stuff out of China and into your own country is really, really fierce as well.
Masks have become a really hot commodity, and most governments are relying on China to get them. China now produces the vast majority of the world's medical masks, so if they're not sending them to you, you're probably not getting any at all. But this hasn't always been the case. In the early days of its own outbreak, China was desperate for PPE. And according to a new global news investigation, they used some pretty questionable methods to get their hands on as much of it as possible. At the center of all of this is the United Front, a shadowy arm of the Chinese government that works to spread the influence of the Chinese Communist Party around the world, including here in Canada. Today, Global News' Sam Cooper is going to take us inside China's efforts to corner the world's supply of PPE. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to Wait, There's More. The last time Sam and I talked, it was about how China was being accused of downplaying the extent of its coronavirus outbreak. Independent analysts were looking at crematoriums and saying that a lot more people had died than China had first let on. This was a couple of weeks ago, and since then, the city of Wuhan has raised its death toll by 50%.
They did up their total slightly and cited the crematoriums. So bit by bit, they're not coming clean and admitting that they covered up, but they're starting to move their statistics in the direction of those that are saying that they covered up this pandemic. Again, since we talked, the Associated Press came out with a very insightful investigation that cites leaked documents, internal high-level Communist Party meetings, January 14th and 15th, in which reportedly Xi Jinping issued strict orders that the pandemic risk was judged to be extremely high. China's Spring Festival was coming up. Therefore, officials in China believed the risk of spread through communities was again extremely high, and they ordered their hospitals to don protective gear, N95 masks, and prepare for the worst.
Okay, so around mid-January, the Chinese government realizes that the new coronavirus could become a pandemic, the risk of community spread is really high, and that they need millions of pieces of personal protective equipment, or PPE, that they don't have.
So taking that information, looking at that timeline, what I looked into was what were the methods that China tried to secure safety supplies while there was still this fog around the danger. And I found that they used something that's called the United Front Work Department. This is a foreign influence and essentially an espionage agency that I've been looking into for a while, and was very interested to learn that this was one of the main channels worldwide that China used to put out the call for groups living in other countries around the world, Chinese immigrants, to answer the call of the motherland, as it was said in China, and send back all the safety masks that they could so that China could fight this virus. By January 23rd in Vancouver, the consulate officials have put out the word to the associated United Front groups in Vancouver. PPE is desperately needed. Activate your members by all channels. Buy as much safety masks as you can, gather them, and they'll be shipped to Wuhan. And then we can trace that this same call goes out through consulates in the major Canadian cities, especially Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa. They set up reportedly WeChat groups, social media, putting out the call to everyone that's answering the call of the motherland. Go and buy as many safety masks as you can. We're going to gather them together and ship them back to China.
And what is the United Front? I've kind of vaguely heard about this organization, but tell me more about it.
This is an organization, the United Front Work Department, that was started in the late 40s. It's a powerful Chinese Communist Party, really what the experts call a political warfare tool. The experts tell us that Xi Jinping has vastly increased its resources in the past few years since he came to power.
United Front's Works Department is, to put it very simply, a political warfare operation, which tries to nullify opposition in other countries and which tries to win the support from the elites in business, in politics, in academia, in media, in target countries.
What it attempts to do is control Chinese diaspora groups worldwide. Their own messaging asserts that if you're a Chinese immigrant, they claim that your allegiance is still to the motherland and the Chinese Communist Party, not the new country where you live and work. And so beyond that, the United Front seeks, it's an foreign influence and foreign policy operation that seeks to really embed in any and all groups in other countries to secure Beijing's policy goals.
And what do we know about the United Front's presence in Canada?
I've been tracking the United Front networks for about a year now, and specifically because I came across something that was odd to me. I've been really following casino money laundering investigations in Vancouver and realized that some of the alleged prominent suspects in RCMP organized crime investigations were also meeting with consulate officials in Vancouver, and we're meeting with self-documented United Front groups in Vancouver. We know that in the past few years, it's been reported in multiple organizations that the Chinese Communist Party is increasingly seeking to assert control over grassroots Chinese Canadian groups that really previously were not political. In Xi Jinping's foreign policy, it appears that the United Front is asserting greater control over groups living around the world that have originated from China.
You looked at the methods and actors used by China to corner the world's supply of PPE. And how was the United Front involved in this? What did their operation look like once they put out these calls?
The United Front is involved in all aspects of China's efforts to buy PPE around the world. For one, there are diplomatic channels used by China. So that would be consulates worldwide are asked to reach out to their counterparts in foreign governments, asking for aid, asking for help in securing safety masks. Also, Chinese-owned companies and state-owned operations. This could include airlines, manufacturers around the world. Their employees are asked, essentially, your mission right now is to go out and by any and all means secure PPE, act to send it back to China. This is job number one. The other method is these community groups that are controlled by the United Front. So the aspect that I looked at most was really the covert nature of the United Front groups that get this early warning signal, we need PPE in Wuhan. They're sent out to retail stores to work day and night, pharmacies, Costco's, all avenues, they say, to buy as much as you can, gather it, and send it back to China. On the other end, the United Front Work Department and Chinese Customs are working together to receive the supplies. We tabulated, according to Chinese reports, at least 100 tons of PPE sent from Canada to China in January and February. Beyond that, China's own customs statistics show that they imported over 2 billion safety masks into China in that 6-week period. So the PPE is gone. It's mostly gone to China when our governments start to realize that our supply is depleted. So that's pretty successful.
Wow. So I know that one of the big efforts to get PPE happened in Toronto. Tell us a bit about what happened with that one specifically.
So the aspect that's helpful in my process as a reporter is the United Front Work Department. Some aspects are very covert and some aspects are very outward-looking and propaganda-based. So the United Front groups involved in the PPE operations, once they have secured supplies, they are taking pictures of these pallets arriving at airports, of the actors out in the community buying the supplies, and then reports come out at a later date. For example, this is one of the interesting, I would call, propaganda-type reports issued from Xinhua, the state media in China. And the report details a worldwide operation involving the Fujian people from southern China that have established vibrant communities worldwide. And it focused on the Toronto Fuking Chamber. I already knew of this chamber because they had been associated with a United Front Department counter-protest in the summer of 2019, in which a number of United Front-linked groups in Toronto demonstrated against Hong Kong democracy.
In downtown Toronto, Hong Kong anti-government protesters facing off against pro-China demonstrators.
I knew that the Fuking Chamber had been involved in these alleged United Front Beijing-directed activities. This report really details an effort by the Fuking Chamber president, who reportedly flew back to China before the Spring Festival, realized the danger and scarcity of supplies was so acute that he decided to fly immediately back to Toronto. The report, I would say, in tones of propaganda, details how the president landed. It was minus 25 degrees Celsius. He raced to the chamber and put out a call, buy PPE now, buy everything you can. It says that 200 members raced around Ontario day and night, bought all the supply they could, and then sent this back to United Front Work Department officials waiting in Fujian region.
So you just said this sounded like propaganda, the story. So how did you corroborate that?
That's right. It sounds like propaganda, and yet, through another source, HNA Hainan Airlines documents that at the same time, they receive a state-directed call to assist in the PPE operation by offering free flights from Toronto to China in order to fly PPE back. It's documented in a Chinese state media report that 56 tons of PPE is sent from Toronto to China in this time period, early February. So we have a few sources, including the photographic evidence that these groups supply, showing that a lot of PPE was sent back, and the Fuking Chamber president is taking credit himself.
Wow. And then similar efforts were also happening in Vancouver. Can you just briefly tell me about those?
Right. So what happens in Vancouver is January 23rd, according to a United Front linked media page, a call is issued from the Chinese consulate to a group called the CACA. This is what's called a controlling level United Front group in Canada. The source of that information is a defected diplomat from China who has arrived in Australia and called this group a very important directing group in Canada. The reports say that the chairman of this group, who's a real estate developer, worked within the community to snap up all the safety supplies possible, including disinfectant and safety masks, and send it back to Wuhan by January 31st. Again, in this case, the Chinese state-linked media provides photographs of the members of this group marshaled around boxes of PPE on the way to the airport.
We'll be right back. So I'm wondering, how influential are these calls from the United Front and from the Chinese government? Are they asking members of their diaspora around the world to do this, or kind of directing them to? How do they exert their influence?
Right. This is an interesting aspect that I'm looking at. And the Canadian Authority on United Front, Jonathan Manthorpe, he's the author that wrote Claws of the Panda, a book about Beijing's influence operations. He says a really troubling aspect, again, is that the United Front is asserting essentially a sort of racial ownership over former Chinese citizens living worldwide.
It's a very racist view. The party considers that anybody of ethnic Chinese origin, even though that may be 5-6 generations ago or more, the party considers that their first loyalty should be a racial loyalty, and it should be to the People's Republic of China.
That doesn't mean that they're always successful. I know from my sources in the Chinese Canadian community that they say the majority of people do not want to be at all under the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. And yet now, through what they call Xi Jinping's more forceful methods, including, I would say, enticements, persuasion, in some cases, intimidation, these groups are coming under the control. So we see what appears to me some powerful and wealthy businessmen are leaders of these groups. They appear to be having some influence within their communities. I talked to one person who had formerly had good relationships with these groups, but he says that he was really cast aside because he has become a voice for democracy in Hong Kong. So a number of sources are saying that the United Front increasingly attempts to influence and control Chinese Canadians, and yet there's I would say a silent majority is steadfastly resisting those efforts at control.
Okay, so just going back to these people who drove around and bought up masks and other disinfecting supplies and things like that, a lot of people who are listening might think, what's wrong with this? They saw what was happening in their home country. There was a serious outbreak and they wanted to help. But what we're saying essentially is that the Chinese government was directing members of the Chinese diaspora around the world to buy up supplies of PPE in their countries of residence while China was hiding the extent of the outbreak, downplaying it, and the world was still sort of clueless about how serious things were going to get.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's some complexities in there. There's still a debate around this, but we have, I would say, a fairly broad consensus of reasonable, nonpartisan people are asserting now that China was concealing the danger through this covert channel involving a worldwide political influence operation. They send out the call to the community, tugging on the patriotic strings, help the motherland, send all the masks you can to China. So we don't know that the people that answer this call, they could be acting with great intentions. They believe the threat in China is what needs to be addressed. And yet, if China's government knew that the risk of threat is imminent, maybe some people that assisted in these operations would have looked at it a different way. Certainly, the politicians I talked to said that they believe this was surreptitious, under the radar, both from China's leadership and the agents involved. These would be directors of these United Front groups, would have some of the political information that was emanating from Beijing.
So we should note that the Chinese consulates and the community organizations that are named in your story haven't responded to your questions, but what has the Chinese government said in response to the criticisms that it cornered the world's supply of PPE?
Well, there's really, in my analysis, two things going on. China, it's clear, is taking, a part in what looks like a sort of information war between the United States and China. China is saying, we did the world a favor. We beat this pandemic within our borders. Now we are sending safety masks worldwide. However, the critics of the United Front Work Department would say that these masks are coming back with political strings attached. Long-term, Mr. Guajardo, the former Mexican ambassador, said in his experience, he didn't pull any punches. He said, when China gives you something, there's going to be an ask. We already know, as I've said, the controversial Chinese telecom Huawei has apparently been the hands used to donate masks around the world, including Canada. Is anything wanted in return? That's a question I think we need to ask. Beyond that, China is saying, we are helping the world. and we're helping Chinese citizens live worldwide. That's good, but in helping Chinese citizens worldwide, are they trying to secure more loyalty in the future? These are questions that the experts would say are important to the fabric of Canada's society and our democracy. One thing that can't be denied is China has most of the supply right now of PPE. They are sitting in the position of having leverage. It's indisputable that countries worldwide are being forced to compete desperately for China's supply. We're reading stories, for example, in the United States of different states or municipal officials racing to meet an actor from China. And, the person that wins delivers a check, gets the supply. We just found out that last week, 2 Canadian planes went to China to buy supply and returned empty-handed.
There are severe restrictions on the ground in China in terms of how long a plane can actually stay in their airports before having to leave, whether it's full or not. For the most part, we've been able to navigate through those and ensure that Canada has received the equipment that it needs. But these 2 airplanes were forced to take off empty.
It's clear that, the mask prices have been bid up from people say $5, $20, perhaps even higher to the prices that were in place early January. So the world is competing for something desperately needed. China secured a lot of it, even though they already produce most of the world's supply.
So to recap, China's leadership is extremely concerned about pandemic risk by mid-January. They order hospitals to use all the safety equipment that they can, and they put out this call through the United Front to buy up all PPE that they can from around the world.
Meanwhile, China has nationalized production and placed export restrictions on their factories. This would include a Canadian company and an American company that reside in China and produce masks. That's why people say they cornered the supply. Not only do they have the supply, but the masks they've already sold to the rest of the world. They use community groups worldwide to buy all of that they can and send it back to China. I think it indicates that we can say that they were extremely concerned about the risks they faced. Again, I don't think we really know to this day. We have no idea how many people died in China. But by looking at this story, they imported 2.5 billion pieces. They were very concerned about what they're facing. And the rest of the world is still finding out how deadly this virus is.
What have been the consequences that we've seen of China's effort to do this, to scoop up billions of pieces of PPE from around the world? What's been the fallout of that for the rest of the world?
In simple terms, the fallout is a supply and demand question. So if China had the supply, went around the world, bought more of it, suddenly, the PPE, most of it is in China, and then the pandemic spreads worldwide. Hospitals worldwide are left, nurses and doctors, without N95 masks. Now we have a desperate scramble to secure the masks to protect our frontline staff. The price has to go up. China has it. So masks that cost $1.05 in January are costing $5, $6, $7, maybe more dollars. Really, this means that the rest of the world is in a position where they are bidding up the prices of masks because it's a life and death consequence.
Okay, Sam, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, that's the show. You can read Sam's investigation at globalnews.ca. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.